The Donkey Kong franchise has long been considered to be one of the best examples of a stellar platforming series, oftentimes sitting right alongside his birth brother, Mario. Now, ironically, despite Donkey Kong, or more specifically Cranky Kong, being the first of these two franchises to start off, it was Mario who would go on to benefit and reap the rewards of Nintendo's continued success, as he quickly became the face of Nintendo and arguably gaming as a whole at the time. Donkey Kong, on the other hand, continued down his own path, releasing a few arcade games ranging from the more classic platforming gameplay seen in the original Donkey Kong to shooters in Donkey Kong 3. Unfortunately, following the release of Donkey Kong 3, the franchise would enter a dormant state, with Nintendo shifting much of its focus to their new star plumber, as well as a few other prominent figures that were quickly becoming fan favorites in their own right. It wasn't until the release of the SNES that Nintendo had the thought to revive the dormant Donkey Kong franchise. They left this task in the hands of an up-and-coming British studio known as Rare, who over the course of 18 months worked on a game which would eventually become known as Donkey Kong Country. This game was very obviously inspired by the Super Mario franchise, yet despite that, there was something about it that was different. Sure, the compressed 3D models and graphical style were groundbreaking for the time, but the point I'm trying to make has much more to do with its gameplay. Donkey Kong Country was fast, precise, and downright unforgiving at times. It may not have been as unforgiving as some of the NES's lineup of games, but when compared to its birth brother Mario, it was night and day just how much more difficult Donkey Kong Country was. With each new release, this challenging difficulty became a cornerstone of the franchise, and arguably got even more brutal. It begs the question then, which Donkey Kong Country game is the hardest? The first Donkey Kong Country game begins on the fittingly named Donkey Kong Island. Here we see that our lifelong supply of bananas has been stolen by King K. Rool and his army of Kremlings, and it's up to us to reclaim them. Our adventures begin in Jungle Hijinks, the first stage of the game. Now, considering this is the first level, it acts mostly as a tutorial for the player, letting them get a feel for the movement of the Kongs as well as some of the dangers to look out for. Unlike other games in its genre, Donkey Kong Country introduced a tag team style of gameplay, where you would have the choice of playing as either Diddy Kong or Donkey Kong. Now, this decision carries more weight than you might think, as their movement capabilities and abilities differ from one another. Diddy Kong, for example, moves, climbs, and swims faster while also being able to jump higher and farther than Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong, on the other hand, can use his brute strength to defeat tougher, bulkier enemies that are often impervious to damage from Diddy Kong. A new player won't necessarily know of these differences at this point in the game, but the lack of dangerous enemies or any real pitfalls does go to ease the player into the experience. That being said, this first stage does include quite a bit. It introduces the Kong letters, which if collected grants an extra life, as well as animal buddies, as you're able to ride atop Rambi the rhinoceros and use them to find secret entrances. By the end of the first stage, I'm sure many players considered this to be a relaxing and fun platformer, akin to the likes of the Mario franchise, but with its own unique flair and aesthetic. Oh, how wrong we were. By the time we reach Ropey Rampage, there is already a large shift in difficulty. For one, the level introduces environmental effects, in this case a thunderstorm. This obscures vision, making it harder to see pitfalls and enemies. And speaking of enemies, they've also become far more lethal. The armies who curl up into balls and ram back and forth are a prime example of this, as they attack at surprisingly fast speeds. This often catches you off guard, and the dark and wet backdrop certainly doesn't help when trying to look out for them. The level also introduces zingers, who have quickly become one of my most hated enemy types. Not only do they obscure countless aerial pathways, but are oftentimes indestructible, making avoiding them your only hope. Thankfully, the Donkey Kong Country franchise has been expertly designed in a way that allows for continuous movement. Now, I don't believe this game was developed with speedrunning in mind, as back during the early 90s, that whole concept was still very much in its infancy. Even so, the developers at Rare wanted to make sure that skilled players would have a seamless experience in which they practically never stopped moving forward. Tangent aside, this means that the zingers, at least in these early stages, don't pose too much of a problem, as they move independently of one another and often in a pattern that benefits those with quick reflexes. Now, you may have caught on that I said in these early stages. Yeah, Ropey Rampage is only the second stage of the first world. By this point, I think many realized that this game was going to be nothing like the more accessible and relaxing 2D Mario platformers. One of the biggest reasons for this is the sheer amount of variety in the design of each level. As we already saw, there was a stark difference even between the first two stages of the game. Rare's creativity certainly didn't stop there either. Reptile Rumble introduces new bouncing mechanics with the use of tires, slippers who are often moving groups across the ground, and jumping critters who think they're playing the game alongside you. Coral Capers then throws us into the water, which not only limits our movement capabilities but also takes away our ability to damage enemies, meaning we're as good as sitting ducks, or monkeys in this case.
Oh, brother! brother, this guy stinks!
These levels by themselves have enough diversity to cover multiple worlds, but the fact that they make up the first few levels of the first world not only goes to show how expressive and creative Rare was in the development of this game, but also how much one would need to adapt on the fly to overcome the challenge presented in each of these new levels. Towards the end of the first world, we come across Candy's save point. As you'd expect, these points allow us to save the game. What you might have not noticed, however, is that this save point is roughly 5 levels deep, meaning that should you game over before reaching another save point, you'll have to start over from the last one you saved at. In this case, that would be at the very start of the game. This added element only adds to the challenge and can oftentimes add immense pressure should you be running low on lives while coming up to a Candy save point. There's a very particular point in this game where this very effect makes it feel almost unfair, but we'll get to that eventually. From here we come across Very Naughty, the first boss of the game. He's honestly a bit of a letdown considering he's a boss, but I guess I'm asking for too much considering this is back in, the 90s. His attacks are very simple, and while his jumps get more sporadic as he jumps faster and further, it's still the only attack he has. Jumping on his head 5 times will finish him off, dropping us our very first giant banana as the Kongs celebrate their victory. Defeating Very Naughty gives us access to Monkey Mines, the second world of the game, and just like any other game, this one looks to up the challenge with each new world. Winky's walkway is simple enough and acts as a nice warm-up to the true horror that awaits you after it, Minecart Carnage. For those of you that have played this game, I'm sure that name brings back certain memories. This stage in particular is where I'd assume many of us hit our first roadblock. The general concept is simple. You're placed in a minecart which travels at its own pace while tasked with avoiding any and all obstacles that stand in your way. Unfortunately, the execution required is anything but simple, and it's here where you truly suffer from the game's smaller 4:3 aspect ratio. The level features extremely tight jumps, unforgiving obstacle placements, many of which require you to jump last second to make it, as well as countless enemy carts that speed towards you off screen. You have to keep your eyes on the emerging tracks while using your peripheral vision to keep notice of when to jump with your cart. It essentially requires some trial and error, mixed with memorization, as the reaction time needed to clear all the obstacles on your first try is most certainly above your average player's capabilities. Thankfully, the levels to follow aren't nearly as bad, but I still feel it's worth noting that even these levels contain their fair share of dangers and tight jumps that require both precise movement and solid timing. By the time I entered Necky's Nuts, and yes, that's indeed the stage name of the second boss, I was on my very last life. Thankfully, Necky isn't too much of a challenge. After dodging his nut attacks and stomping his head a few times, I managed to defeat Necky, while also dying at the exact same time. Now, if you recall how saving works in this game, you'll also realize that because I died here and game overed, it meant I had to go back through the last few levels before I even got another shot at the boss. Now, after clapping Necky's nuts, we move into what I consider to be the easiest point of this game, with Vine Valley. Now, this isn't to say that the levels in this world are extremely easy or anything. Far from it, in fact. Even up to this point, each stage offers a mostly unique and fun experience that hasn't been seen so far. They may play out in similar backdrops, but the level designs themselves are different enough to stimulate a gradual sense of progression in both a player ability and the game's challenge. Vine Valley ends with Queen Bee, a massive zinger who you fight in the now standard boss arena. Because this space is so limited in both its size and structure, there's not much difference between this boss and Very Naughty. Instead of jumping from side to side across the room, Queen Bee will move up and down across the room. The difference this time though is that you must use barrels to damage Queen Bee, which honestly makes it even easier. You don't even have to throw them, you can quite literally just hold them while running into Queen Bee. Once she's swatted, we once again celebrate as we move into Gorilla Glacier, which is arguably the most brutal world in the entire game. It starts off with Snow Barrel Blast, a level where as you progress, so does the intensity of this snowstorm. This not only obscures your vision heavily, but some sick fuck at Rare decided to add rotating barrels into the stage. This may seem fairly standard at this point in the game, and by themselves they aren't necessarily hard to time. This takes on a whole new meaning though, when you can hardly see the position they're facing. If that wasn't bad enough, they also added in zingers that move around these barrels at increasing speeds. I honestly could go on and on about this stage, as I believe it to be one of the hardest levels in the entire game. Slip Slide Ride continues the snow-based theming with its slippery slopes, but also introduces ropes that either make you ascend or descend. This does result in some pretty challenging segments, but also some interesting animations. Ice Age Alley brings back everyone's favourite snowstorm. Not that it matters considering the design of this level centres around fast swinging ropes that fly from off screen so you can't see them anyway. Croctopus Chase is most likely the easiest out of this little set, as it plays out like a survival horror game with every enemy under the water chasing you down until you die. Now while these levels each offer a decent challenge in themselves, they aren't the core reason as to why this world is so unforgiving. The number one reason for why this world is so frustratingly hard is Candy's save point. Not so much the existence of it, but the position in which it was placed. This save point opens up after finishing Torchlight Trouble, the 5th stage in Gorilla Glacier, meaning from the last save point, the player must have played through 7 normal stages and 1 boss stage. We've already discussed just how difficult these stages are, so having to complete all of them in a row with a limited number of lives makes this gauntlet one of the hardest parts in the entire game. Now there are ways to cut out the few remaining stages in Vine Valley. You can go back to Vine Valley following Queen Bee's defeat, where you can use the save point at Candy's there before taking Funky's flights back to Gorilla Glacier, which I honestly recommend for anyone thinking of playing this game. Even then though, you still have to pass through what I consider to be one of the hardest levels in the entire game, alongside another 4 decently challenging ones. After a rematch with a slightly more aggressive Naughty though, we find ourselves in the heart of the Kremlin Army's production facilities. Now personally, I expected a lot more out of these levels. They're not exactly cakewalks, but compared to the pain I felt as I worked my way through Gorilla Glacier, these felt far easier. Trick Track Trek had some tougher moments with its auto-scroller segments, and you might as well be playing blindfolded for certain parts of Blackout Basement. But by this point, most players would have developed the necessary skills to complete these levels with ease. Even the final boss of this stage is just an enemy gauntlet disguised as an intimidating barrel. I don't mean to bash on the game because I truly do love this franchise, but you can tell Rare was running out of ideas by this point. I mean, come on. We're in Kremrock Industries, the main manufacturing site of the invaders, and the big bad boss at the end is just, what, a bigger oil drum that drops the same enemies we've been facing throughout the whole game? The less said about this guy, the better. Thankfully though, the game's final world does not disappoint. Tanked Up Trouble proves to be a far more challenging iteration of Trick Track Trek, where you now need to collect oil drums to keep your motor platform moving. To reach most of them, however, you'll need to take side paths or jump over enemies and other obstacles, which only adds to the difficulty. Loopy Lights was one of the most immersive levels as the lighting directly matched my room's lighting as I was playing through it, while also leading up to the one level that may top Snow Barrel Blast as the hardest in the entire game. This is Platform Perils, a brutal level that combines some of the toughest enemies with some of the most precise platforming possible. The level is designed around these moving platforms that generously tell you which way they're going to move, before eventually falling for good. This not only adds a time limit to the decision making process, but also builds on the pressure that is continuously surfaced throughout this stressful level. This leads up to a climactic final stretch where you have to navigate across multiple moving platforms, all while taking out these beefy critters. Problem is, you can't jump on them as they have a knockback effect. So your only hope is to take them out with these barrels, which you only get one chance at each time. It's only another trial and error mode, as the platforms even take unexpected turns. Like this guy who's behind you off screen. Like how are you supposed to know he's there the first time around? The area finishes off with Master Neki Sr., who works in a similar way to Master Neki, only he's far more aggressive with his nuts. Take that however you want. From here we gain access to Gangplank Galleon, which acts as the final arena for the fight against King K. Rool. This fight for the most part is fairly manageable. His attack patterns are quite simple, and despite them getting faster with each hit, they aren't necessarily hard to dodge. Well, at least that's how it appears when you first face it. After stomping on him a few more times, King K. Rool collapses to the ground while the credits start to roll. Here's where you can put down your controller, sit back, and congratulate yourself on beating one of the toughest SNES. Wait, what? Yeah. So this asshole just gets back up and starts jumping around sporadically. This second phase, or third, isn't particularly hard either, but compared to his earlier more pattern-based moveset, this one is sure to catch out many players. It certainly got me a few times, but after a few tries and a few more head stomps, we broke him down for a final time, before reuniting with Cranky Kong and seeing all our bananas had been recovered. At the end of the first Donkey Kong Country, I had seen the game over screen 4 times, while having died a total of 33 times. Certainly not the most I've died during a game, but as we'll see, this is only just the beginning. Thankfully, fans of the series wouldn't have to wait long, as just over a year later, Rare was back with the fittingly titled Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest. Smart. Now despite its rapid release, Donkey Kong Country 2 features some pretty significant changes to both its gameplay and level designs. For one, titular character Donkey Kong has been replaced by Dixie Kong, who can use her hair to spin both while on the ground acting as an attack, and in the air allowing her to glide down slowly. Diddy Kong on the other hand retains all of his abilities and strengths from the previous game. The game also features far more collectibles and coins, many of which are crucial with regards to central parts of the gameplay. We'll get around to these specific ones soon. The game begins with us learning that Donkey Kong has been captured by King K. Rool, and it's up to Diddy and Dixie to rescue him. The game starts us off in Gangplank Galleon, which should look very familiar, as it was the last section in which we took on King K. Rool in the first game. I always thought this was a nice touch. We start Donkey Kong Country 2 where we finished the original Donkey Kong Country. It's a somewhat seamless transition which goes to show just how far we've come and how much we've overcome since the very start of the first game. Pirate Panic, much like Jungle Hijinks, acts as the tutorial stage where you can get a feel for the game and the new abilities of Dixie. The enemies found here aren't particularly dangerous, nor are there too many gaps to fall into. What I will say is that compared to the first Donkey Kong Country, the diversity between each stage in the sequel isn't as vast, at least during the earlier sections of the game. This isn't to say there aren't any new additions or gimmicks added with each level, as the first one has you climbing mast nets while avoiding sliding enemies and jumping around over gaps with these hooks. Unfortunately, most of them still revolve around a central theme, and understandably so given that we're on a ship. The similarities within these earlier levels makes the starting worlds of Donkey Kong Country 2 far easier in my opinion than the original Donkey Kong Country. Now while we're on the topic of comparison, one thing I should note is how saving works in this game, as compared to the original. You may have noticed me collecting coins in some of the gameplay being shown. These are banana coins, the currency used for every and anything in this game. Essentially everything that was once free now costs banana coins. This means that subsequent saves after the first one in each world will cost you 2 banana coins, as does hiring a plane through Funky's flights to travel to other worlds. While this doesn't directly add to the game's difficulty, it can result in further setbacks if you aren't able to save at certain moments due to a lack of coins. To help counterbalance this change, Rare also added short quiz minigames in the form of Swanky's bonus bonanza. Should you answer all the questions correctly, Swanky will award you with extra life balloons, with the number directly correlating to the cost of the quiz. And while having more lives doesn't mean you're going to suddenly perform better, it does allow for more chances at learning the levels and improving, hopefully resulting in less game overs in the long run. It begs the question then, why did Rare feel the need to add in so many extra lives? As I was saying, the first area doesn't switch things up too much, and its levels, while fun, are hardly difficult. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately for us players, this was about to change. The second area, dubbed the Crocodile Cauldron, really takes things up to the next level. Red Hot Ride in particular gave me an immense amount of trouble. The main gimmick in this level revolves around these hot air balloons that you must use to navigate across the treacherous pits of lava. Now that in itself doesn't sound too bad, but when you're frantically jumping from one balloon to another while avoiding zingers and crunches who have the most annoying pushback effect, it can get to be quite challenging. It was also around this point where I noticed just how tight some of the timing was, and just how precise some of the jumps needed to be to make it through this level. The final boss of this area sees you facing off against Cleaver, a sentient cutlass. Now despite the fight being a fairly fun one, it isn't particularly challenging considering you can oftentimes abuse Dixie's gliding ability with the hooks. You also don't even necessarily need to throw these cannonballs, as most of the time Cleaver will just run into them while you're holding them. Now some of you might be thinking, well hold on, this game doesn't seem nearly as hard as the original, and by this point I'd actually agree. As I stated earlier, because Donkey Kong Country 2 is separated into distinct regions, each with their own core theming, it meant that the overall variety and level design suffered a bit. Krem Key, for example, tries to switch things up by going from a swamp to the ship hold underwater and then to the ship deck and mast, but for the most part they're all still centered around either the swamp or the ship, which we already had a whole world based on before. I don't mean to say this makes the game significantly easier, far from it, as the platforming in Donkey Kong Country 2 is far more precise with an even lower margin of error than the first game. Despite the trickier platforming requirements though, the lack of level variety means players will have grown accustomed to the levels at a faster rate. There are outliers of course, Slime Climb being a perfect example of this. While this level plays out on the ship mast once again, it adds a new challenge with the ever-rising water. Before you think this water is safe to swim in, it actually contains one of the few truly invincible enemies, Snapjaw, who looks like he hasn't feasted in decades. This adds a sense of urgency to your decision making, and should you fall behind, well, yeah. Krem Key also contains the iconic Bramble Blast, and while the level itself may not be that hard, its music certainly goes the hardest. Escaping the maze that is Bramble Blast sees us coming face to face with Kudgel, an immensely jacked Kremling. He can certainly be a pain at first. I didn't realize I had to jump when he landed to avoid getting stunned. From what I could tell, his landing positions seemed to be predetermined, so it kind of comes down to memorization, which isn't all that difficult, but it did take me a few attempts to get down. I always used to think that this guy was just an older version of Clubber, and that's why he had that graying skin. kind of like us when we start to get grey hairs. I'm honestly not sure if there was ever any relation between the two though. Crazy Kremland is where I honestly believe the game starts to get extremely challenging. And no, it's not because we finally get some minecart levels. Okay, maybe it is, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, as even the very first level of this world, Hornet Hole, is quite challenging. One of the main selling points of these games is the slick and fast-paced platforming movement. This is even more pronounced in Donkey Kong Country 2, which replaced the slow and rigid Donkey Kong for another small agile character in Dixie. But what if that smooth movement was taken away from you? That's the whole gimmick with these beehive-based levels. The floor and even the walls are covered in honey, making moving impossible unless you're jumping. Of course, to make things even worse, the developers decided to throw in countless zingers and spinies that for whatever reason don't seem to be getting stuck in the same goop. So there you are, doing mini jumps to move slightly forward so that you can make half the jumps, while also not moving too far ahead and landing on a spiny. Now if these hive levels weren't bad enough, Crazy Kremland also brings back minecart stages, except this time they're roller coasters. Now I'm not sure if Nintendo didn't get the memo or something, but roller coasters are supposed to be fun. I can't say for certain if these stages captured that feeling too well though. They still contain the same fast-paced, precise platforming, but have added elements like having to hit certain barrels to open the pathway, except you're only supposed to hit some of them. See, Rare loves to fuck with its players, so the first barrel they place opens the gate as intended. This primes the player to think, oh, a barrel? I hit it, I proceed. Except you don't, because the very next barrel they place does the exact opposite and blocks the path. There was some seriously sadistic developers over at Rare, let me tell you. You end up facing off against the same King Zing that chased you out of the penultimate level, and this might just be the worst boss in the entire game. Not only do you need to play as Squawks, who's annoying as fuck to control, but the aim and precision needed to hit the stinger while this dumbass bee zooms around at increasing speeds is brutal. I wouldn't even call this fight hard. More frustrating, as King Zing isn't very hard to avoid. It's just being able to get into position in time to fire your projectiles at the right time, and yeah, sometimes it takes a while. Speaking of animal companions, Donkey Kong Country 2 often has you turning into them instead of just riding on top of them. Not only does this limit you to 2 hits, but it also means the levels designed for them are unique and therefore far more challenging. Web Woods, for example, has you transform into Squitter and use his webs to create platforms for you to stand on. Now if you're like me, you're gonna suck ass at using Squitter. So of course I'm there taking my time, trying to carefully avoid all the zingers while making my way across the seemingly endless gap. Now that would be great and all, if the platforms didn't randomly crumble away. At first I thought it was random, but after replaying this level a few times, it does seem to have to do with having a limited number of webs on screen at once. But who knows? Whatever the case, this level remains one of the toughest in the game. The rest of Gloomy Gulch wasn't too bad, although each level does have its own unique challenge. Ghostly Grove introduces ghostly ropes that disappear periodically, Parachute Panic has you navigate some very narrow gaps with the less talented Quarks, and Gusty Glade introduces another environment effect that changes the direction in which the wind blows. Thank God they didn't place this effect on a Brambles level. While you're flying as Squawks, wouldn't that just be like the worst? Gloomy Gulch ends with a fight against Creepy Crow, who's mainly just a dodging simulator as you get swarmed by copious amounts of mini-neckies. Defeating him grants us access to the final area of the main game, K. Rool's Keep. Surprisingly, this world starts off pretty easy with Arctic Abyss. This doesn't last long as the game then throws you straight into Windy Well. As I mentioned earlier in this video, these games are centered around the fast-paced movement capabilities of the Kongs. Any level that limits these capabilities or slows you down oftentimes are the hardest. Windy Well does just that by taking the wind effect of Gusty Glade, but instead of changing it, it makes it the core gimmick and the transversal of the level. What this ends up looking like is excruciatingly long wait times while you try and perfectly time your movements with the updraft of the wind. The margin of error on some of these movements is close to zero, with you having to perfectly time consecutive drops below countless Zinger type enemies. If you screw up, well, you'll have plenty of time to think about how much of a loser you are as you watch Dixie endlessly fall like she's in Jump King. That's how most of the levels feel in this final world. Castle Crush is tough mainly due to it being an auto-scroller, but it also does a very good job of matching enemies such that they cover for each other's weaknesses. For example, this level often throws pairs of enemies at you. Here you see a Clampon, who's more susceptible to jump attacks, paired up with a Spiny, who's impervious to jump attacks. So having to jump on one while roll attacking the other is quite difficult. especially in such an enclosed space. I lost countless lives working my way through this world. You want to know what the worst part of it all is though? These levels pale in comparison to the true horrors that await us at the end. Welcome to Toxic Tower, which is often considered one of the toughest levels in the entire game. It's essentially a gauntlet in which you cycle through multiple animal companions as you hastily make your way up the tower before being consumed by the rapidly rising toxic waste. This wouldn't be so bad if they hadn't chosen the two hardest animal companions to control. Yes, you must play as Squitter. I guess at least this time there's no dark chasm below you. There is toxic waste though, from jumping across zingers with expert precision to narrowly avoiding them as you fly through tight passageways, to then quickly ascending a large room using web platforms that you have to make yourself. Each section adds into the ever-growing pressure of the rising toxic waste and ultimately makes for one of the most challenging levels in the entire game. There is a light at the end of the tunnel though, as upon finishing Toxic Tower, we're able to finally rescue Donkey Kong.
Wait a minute!
Okay, I lied. Instead, we ascend to reach the Flying Croc, which thankfully only has 2 stages, that somehow feel like 10. I'm sorry, but whoever picked this game up and could just speed through Screech's sprint while collecting all the other bonus items on their first try may just be the most talented gamer ever. As the name suggests, this is a race against Screech at a bramble-based flying level. I'm sure you can already see the problem here. Controlling Squawks has never been easy, so having to navigate this maze-like area with death traps on all sides, all while trying to keep a very fast pace, is a frustratingly hard task. Honestly, I just ended up brute forcing my way through the level, while avoiding most of the other bonus items. This leads us to our second confrontation with King K. Rool, and this time he's certainly improved his arsenal. It offers a nice challenge with a series of complex attack patterns. This often has you avoiding a barrage of cannon shots, gas shots that can either freeze you or invert your controls, as well as his charge attacks that increase in speed over the course of the fight. The fight is decently long as well, and in my opinion is certainly harder than our first confrontation with him in the first game. I think it is a fair fight, and with enough perseverance and skill, he's not that bad. After dealing the penultimate blow, Donkey Kong jumps down to finish him off with one last punch. With that, we once again reunite with Cranky Kong as the credits roll. At the end of the game, I had died a whopping 114 times, as well as seeing the game over screen 13 times. I know someone will bring it up, so I'll just state it here. No, I won't be including the secret worlds from each game. I did play through the levels in Donkey Kong Country 2, but the method in obtaining access to a lot of these worlds is quite tedious, and this isn't which Donkey Kong Country game is the hardest to 100%. I might make that video one day though. Yes, that means I won't bore you with another rant on how Animal Antics is bullshit. For anyone that's played it, don't worry, I know your pain. I felt it about 51 times to be exact. But enough about that, let's move on to the final game of the original trilogy, Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Following the events of Donkey Kong Country 2, we find ourselves in Dixie's shoes. After seeing a note left by Diddy explaining that he had gone exploring with Donkey Kong, we learn that they are nowhere to be found. We then get to team up with another member of the Kong tribe, Kiddy Kong, as we search for the other lost Kongs. Kiddy Kong works a lot more like Donkey Kong than Diddy Kong as you'd expect. He's a heavier, bulky Kong and can therefore clap stronger enemies as well as be thrown to destroy certain floorboards, revealing hidden entrances. Our adventure starts in Lake Orangutan, in a particular lakeside limbo. Now this stage plays like any other tutorial stage. The enemies are simple yet lethal, the level introduces you to the newest animal companion, Ellie the elephant, and the level contains hardly any gaps to fall off. This simplicity carries on with many of the levels on Lake Orangutan. Sure, each stage has its own unique gimmicks, but none of them tended to be that difficult. Skitter's Row was probably the trickiest, mainly due to the slippery grounds and the awkward movements of the skitters. Even so, I'd consider the first area in both Donkey Kong Country 1 and Donkey Kong Country 2 to be far harder than Lake Orangutan. My first death was at the hands of Belcher, the game's first boss, and it wasn't because he was hard, I just had no idea what I was doing the first time around. After figuring out I'm supposed to be making him eat his own junk, he was a cakewalk as well. From here we enter into Kremwood Forest. I must say, for what Donkey Kong Country 2 lacked in level variety early on, Donkey Kong Country 3 certainly makes up for it. Barrel Shield Bust Up has you avoiding minky throws with these moving barrels. Riverside Race has you running from a swarm of killer bees, while Squeals on Wheels has you taking out sneaks with steel cakes to open up the doors located around the level. Each level feels distinct from one another, and while the gimmicks attached to each one aren't necessarily challenging, the sheer amount of variety that goes on in each level means that the player has to adapt at a fast rate. The world sees you facing off against Arish, who's far tougher than Belcher. The hitboxes around his legs and abdomen are strangely inconsistent inconsistent to the point where it feels random when you can jump up onto his legs, as it works at certain times but not others. I would advise playing as Dixie here, as her smaller frame makes dodging these bouncing venom balls far easier. Also, Dixie, unlike Kitty, holds the barrel above her head, making hitting Arich's face a lot safer from underneath. Overall, a decent challenge for this point in the game, and one that took me a few tries to get down. Upon its defeat, Arich drops a patch which tripped me up. Figuring out what to do with this patch was honestly the hardest part of the game so far. As you can probably tell by now, I had never played Donkey Kong Country 3 before this. After about 20 minutes of just zooming around the open map, doing some of the dumbest things ever, I went back to Funky's rentals so that Funky could use the patch to craft us a new vehicle, the hovercraft. This lets us travel across rocks, granting us access to more of the world map. The introduction of this open plain map allows players to run through certain worlds in their own order. Here, players have the choice of both Cotton Top Cove and Mechanos, but my lazy ass just chose the closer of the two, that being Mechanos. Mechanos houses the world's first minecart style level, but once again ups the challenge. Instead of just having to pay attention to the ground and obstacles around it, this tube has you attaching yourself to the ceiling as well, moving between the two to collect bonus items and avoid enemies and other dangers. Like the majority of minecart style levels, the jumps here are extremely precise, with barely enough room to squeeze past all the floating buzzers. Now, if you thought being chased by a set of killer bees was terrifying, how about a ripsaw that continuously cuts its way up the screen? Levels like these are always more challenging as they give you very little breathing room to make decisions. This, paired with the multiple pathways and maze-like structure of the tree stump, means you'll most likely be playing this level through a few times at least. Low-G Labyrinth completely switches up the gameplay, from the more standard, precise, fast-paced movements to now slower, more purposeful movements that require accurate timing. It's another example of a gimmick that is only used once in the entire game. I will never understand why they decided to add Quark's flying section into this level, as it kind of defeats the purpose of the low gravity, but if I'm being honest, that segment is probably the hardest part of the level. Speaking of hardest sections though, the final boss of this world is Chaos, who is unquestionably the hardest boss from any game, at least for this early on into the game. This hunk of metal might look slow, but timing your rolls to avoid its flames isn't as simple as it looks. Not only that, but having to platform up these flimsy ass blades is extremely awkward, as they consistently move from side to side as you're jumping up them. Even just slightly touching this guy's body will cause a little small knockback that most often than not will knock you off his blades anyway. Oh, and he has a punching glove that's just there solely to knock you off as well. During his second phase, his helmet comes off and shoots lasers at you, which you must dodge constantly at the last second. After a few attempts, I did finally get this guy down, but my god, was he far harder than I initially expected, especially after what I had just witnessed in the game so far. Upon his defeat, he drops the ski. I'm sure you know what this means, but before we head over to Funky's to get him to make us a new rocket ship, we need to clear out Cotton Top Cove. Now, the only stages worth mentioning in this world are the ones where you play as Ellie the elephant. I'm going to be honest here, she's probably my least favorite animal buddy. Yes, even less than Squitter the spider. She has absolutely zero enhancements to her movements, being able to jump essentially, and that's it. Knowing this, Rare placed her in Tracker Barrel Trek, which involves you navigating upwards using tracker barrels that shoot you out constantly. The timing required to avoid it with the buzzers is especially tight here, most notably when you need to travel under them. The other instance where you play as Ellie, funnily enough, is against the boss of the world, who appears as a set of eyes and a mouth. Now, with a name like Squirt, you're bound to ask, what that mouth do? No? Just me? Well, regardless, chances are that you've already found out what this guy's mouth does, because he instantly starts squirting his liquids all over you. I would imagine he's been doing some fun things in private as well, as the floors and edges of the platforms are quite wet and slippery, causing you to slip off to your death a lot of the time. Innuendos aside, this boss is fairly frustrating and can be quite a challenge as he starts to speed up his squirting as the fight edges towards its climax. The idea here is to use Ellie's trunk to suck up some liquid, which can then be used to take out his eyes. Spitting it into his eyes does enough to finish him off, and with him fully drained of life, we obtain our second ski. Back we go to Funky's Rentals, where we hand over the skis so that he can build us the turbo ski, allowing us to somehow ascend up waterfalls. Don't ask me how. Ascending the waterfalls here gives us access to the final 3 worlds of the base game, the first of which being K3. K3's theming means that a lot of the levels here consist of slippery floors or treacherous mountain ranges. Crevice creepers will test your speed and reaction time, as it's essentially a high ropes course but with clasps. What are clasps, I hear you asking? Well, they're these guys, and despite them looking harmless from afar, just wait until you get up close with them. As you can see, clasps' whole gimmick is that they will follow your movements as to block you from ascending up and down the ropes. The idea then is to zoom to either side and quickly jump up past them before they can get to you. This can get pretty hectic towards the end of the level, with multiple jumps and decisions being made in a very short period of time. Now if you thought controlling Squitter was hard enough, try doing that while platforming across molten bubblegum, all while being shot at by someone with aimbot. This ups the ante even more, making sure you have hardly any time to place your webs. The final boss for this area takes this swanky sideshow minigame to the next level, instead having you take on Bleak in a snowball fight. It's a bit tougher as the player has to manually switch between close throws and long throws. Honestly, I thought it was just random during my first attempt. You then have to kind of weave in your own snowball attacks while dodging hits, which honestly isn't the hardest thing out there. He still remains one of the most unique and fun bosses in the game though. Now after displaying your dominant snowball skills, Rare unlocks the way to another world, Razor Ridge. This world more than any really likes to mess around with animal companions, essentially having them play crucial roles in almost every level. Buzzer Barrage has you flying through as Quarks, Floodlight Fish has you riding atop Enguarde, and Pothole Panic has you gliding through its tight caves with Squawks. None of them compared to Kong-fused Cliffs though, which isn't just an auto-scroller, but also a memorization level. See, even though the screen doesn't move too fast, you're stuck in the center of the screen. You can't descend too low because of the flaming rope, but you also can't just sit at the top of the screen, as there's plenty of buzz enemies that fly around often on alternating sides of the rope. So unless your reaction time is superhuman, you're most likely going to die to at least one of these things. The boss of this world is especially annoying only because it's in the water and you have to play as an animal companion. I have to say, any boss where they make you play as these guys is pretty annoying. Your movement abilities are inconsistent and the number of plausible methods when it comes to damaging the boss are very limited. This boss has 3 phases, the hardest of which is his second. His third one is a joke, you don't even have to move to dodge his frenzy of spikes. There's also some very questionable hitboxes when it comes to these animal companions, which isn't a good thing when the whole idea of this fight is to bait in his own attacks to hit him. Overall, a frustrating boss, who I wouldn't necessarily consider to be that difficult. With Barbos annihilated though, we can now venture forth into the final world of the main story. This world is a culmination of every previous world mashed into one, and the developers decided to save the most challenging gimmicks for last. You have jungle levels which introduce conveyor ropes that move you at sonic speeds in each direction. You have cave levels that introduce ghost barrels that appear and disappear at certain intervals. You even have a level centered around coin enemies, whose whole purpose is to knock you off the map. Damn, I really got that 1-2 treatment. You wanna know the worst part though? These are the more normal stages in the world. Now when I first played through Lightning Lookout, the first thing that came to mind was which fucking arsehole designed this piece of shit level. As most people probably do, I assumed the lightning was just randomly striking where I was and there was nothing I could do about it. This was until about my 3rd death. See, to many first time players, these lightning strikes may appear random, but what you may realize is that this is a stellar example of perfect level design, especially for the SNES. The game does in fact give you clues of where the lightning is going to strike. It's then up to the player's reflexes and decision making to decide their next movement. There are also barrels spawned into the level that can be used to remove enemies, but another use for them is to hold them over your head with Dixie. This will block the lightning strikes, leaving the player unharmed. I don't particularly like the water sections as they make the lightning unavoidable in most cases, but outside of that, this level, while challenging, is one of my new favorites. The world ends off with Poisonous Pipeline. But wait, hold on, you can swim in this water. So what's the poisonous part about? Well, this isn't your average drinking water. Oh no, this water inverts your controls. Now the level itself isn't actually that hard. There aren't any super annoying enemies, but the fact that your controls are inverted makes all enemies dangerous. You can see the moment I get hit, I start to panic and lose all my composure. It also results in some very awkward moments when trying to jump out of the water. God, dude, this level actually makes you feel like a dumbass. Hopefully you don't end up spending too much time in that poisonous waste, as we're moving on to the final world of Donkey Kong Country 3, which is actually a set of 2 bosses. First off is a rematch against the Chaos Machine, but honestly this fight's a lot easier, as it only takes 1 hit on each phase to destroy him. Beating him reveals the true mastermind, Baron K. Rulenstein. Unfortunately though, this guy isn't very hard either. The general idea is to throw barrels into his jetpack. I will say that he has a lot of phases, meaning that you'll need to stay focused for a prolonged period of time. Unfortunately, and this is just my personal opinion, but most of these phases aren't very challenging at all. He's not exactly a major threat given that he just flies back and forth across the room. All you really need to do is avoid him by using the hooks. His later phases have him summoning conductors that zap the ground frequently, making it harder to reach the barrel. For whatever reason though, the developers decided to not allow Baron K. Rulenstein to reach the platforms on either side, meaning you can just move from one to the other and just wait there with the barrels until he turns around. This not only gives you free access to his weak point, but it also doesn't put you in any danger, as you're off the ground and he can't even reach you regardless. Ultimately a pretty disappointing final boss. With him defeated though, we once again return to Cranky Kong as the credits roll. At the end of Donkey Kong Country 3, I died 56 times while never seeing the game over screen. This means it sits comfortably in the middle of the other two games, and I think that's where it deserves to be. Donkey Kong 1 stages are far simpler with less gimmicks, while Donkey Kong 2 levels, while not as creative in certain aspects, seem to require far more precise timing and platforming. Donkey Kong Country 3 has some of the hardest stages in the original trilogy, but for the majority of its levels they're fairly bare bones like Donkey Kong Country 1. Following the success of the original trilogy, you'd expect the franchise to continue flourishing. Unfortunately though, coming into the 2000s, Rare would be acquired by Microsoft, stumping any possible development on a new entry into the franchise. For many, the continuation of this particular franchise couldn't have been more ambiguous, especially when its revival was kickstarted by a completely different franchise. Now Metroid Prime didn't directly revive the Donkey Kong Country franchise, but its success definitely opened up the gateway. More so, it was the developers of Metroid Prime, Retro Studios, who following the success of Metroid Prime were tasked by Nintendo to work on a new Donkey Kong Country game. The resulting product would release on the start of a new decade with a name that couldn't be more fitting. Donkey Kong Country had officially returned, but the question remains, could Retro Studios capture the same challenge and platforming magic that had made the original trilogy so legendary? Let's find out, shall we? We once again begin on Donkey Kong Island, this time in the midst of a volcano's eruption. This eruption doesn't result in any catastrophic lava flows though, and instead reveals the Tiki-Taka tribe, a group of demons with the ability to hypnotize the wildlife. They use this ability to have the other animals collect all the bananas, for reasons unknown at this point. Upon noticing this, the Kongs venture forth to reclaim their stolen stash as per usual. Now I know some people didn't appreciate this new set of villains after so many years of growing accustomed to the Kremling army, but I personally liked the change as it added a newer perspective, and as we'll see, it allowed for far more potential with its level designs. Now this could just be a byproduct of working with newer technology, but the sheer potential in the creativity department that comes with a new whole enemy type is undeniable in my opinion. Unimportant mentions aside, we start off like any other Donkey Kong Country game in a jungle themed area known simply as, well, the jungle. There are a few important things to note about this game that have a significant impact on its difficulty compared to the original trilogy. For one, Donkey Kong is the only playable character, with Diddy Kong acting purely from a supporting role, with his rocket ability allowing us to maintain airtime after a jump for a short while. You will also notice that even as one Kong, this game gives you 2 hearts. When joined by Diddy, this goes up to 4 hearts, meaning you can take twice as many hits in this game when compared to the older ones. Donkey Kong can also ground pound consistently, which can be used to reveal secrets, break objects, and most importantly, knock over enemies in close proximity, limiting their overall lethality. So far these all sound like player buffs, right? But you have to wonder, was there a reason as to why Retro felt the need to give the player 4 hearts instead of the usual 2? For now though, let us make our way through Jungle Hijinks once again. If you haven't noticed by now, this is the same name given to the very first level of the original Donkey Kong Country. This first level, like most of the Donkey Kong Country games, is straightforward. There are barely 3 enemy types, all of which are simple enough to take out, and the gaps, while existing, aren't very frequent. Mainly these levels just help you get a feel for the controls of the Kongs. It also looks to introduce the new grab and climbing mechanic introduced in Returns, as they will become prominent parts of tougher levels later on. Even by the second level though, you can tell just how much more forgiving this game is. Hearts are littered around everywhere, and the number of Diddy Kong barrels seem even more frequent than in the original Donkey Kong trilogy games. This gives players a lot of leeway to make mistakes, as there are usually either hearts or whole barrels just around the corner to restock back on health. Just like Donkey Kong Country 3, this game also features a shop, but rather than little collectibles, these items actually help you get through tougher levels in the game, be that with more lives offered or upgrades like the heart boost or banana juice, which straight up just makes you invincible. As OP as these seem, they're not nearly as broken as future iterations. To make things more even though, I chose not to buy any of the items that gave me an unfair advantage. This meant I would only be buying lives and the key if needed, as I assumed they wouldn't drastically change the design or difficulty of each level. The jungle world in general features many simplistic levels as you'd expect. Canopy Canyons has a rather cheesy death trap where it'll make you think you can continuously shoot from cannon to cannon before making the last one a directional one to trip players up at the last second. This world also features everyone's favourite minecart stages, and they continue to be some of the toughest levels in the entire game. It's hard to say whether or not I would consider them to be tougher than the ones in the original trilogy. For one, the camera has panned out, making it significantly easier to see what is coming next. Yet for whatever reason, Retro decided to make any hit while in the minecart a one-hit kill. In the original trilogy, if you had your partner with you, you, you'd be able to tank at least one hit, but in returns that same rule doesn't apply. These two differences kind of balance out, allowing for an adequate challenge that doesn't feel completely cheap. One more thing I'd like to point out about this game is its use of checkpoints. In the original trilogy, no matter the level, you'd get one checkpoint, usually towards the midpoint, essentially meaning you'd have to beat the level in 2 whole parts without losing all your lives. In returns, these checkpoints have been doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled in certain levels. You may argue there's a need for that, and on minecart levels I would agree, as you're only allowed one hit. For the rest though, I think this is heavily overtuned. You've already been given 4 hearts to work with, as well as numerous Diddy barrels and extra hearts, all of which make for a much easier experience, at least during the first half of the game. Now, as much as I'd love to gush about each and every level of this game, as I think Returns features some of the most fun and well-designed levels in the entire franchise. I mean, come on, a calming beachfront turned nightmarish after witnessing a cracking, sinking of ship in the background, only for that same kraken to lock in on you and use its tentacle to act as obstacles for you to platform around. I mean, how could you not love levels like this? Unfortunately though, they aren't particularly challenging. Part of the reason why is due to this game's pace. It's far slower than the original trilogy, and while the platforming is just as tight and precise as those earlier games, the slower nature of the game means it's far easier to adjust and make those exact jumps. Diddy Kong's hover ability also helps tremendously, to the point where I considered playing through the game without Diddy at all. This thought continued with me until I hit the cave, which acts as World 4, and it's roughly about the halfway point of the game. Now, I'm not sure if Retro meant for this to be a midpoint hurdle, but outside of mainly the final world, this cave world is by far the hardest in the entire game. Now, if you've played through this game, you're most likely agreeing with me, but if you haven't, you're probably wondering what about it makes it so challenging. As was the case with Donkey Kong Country 2, Returns centers its worlds around certain themes, and the cave's theme lends well to a certain design type. Yep, you've guessed it. This world is full of minecart levels, all of which get harder and harder the further you progress. Some of these levels incorporate regular platforming into them, resulting in a rather diverse set of skills being challenged. The one-hit kills also make each of these stages extremely unforgiving, and a lot of them required you to duck under ceilings just to make a last-second jump straight after. That often needs to be timed, as long jumps may take you too far off the beaten path, while smaller hops don't give you enough distance. Even the goddamn boss of this world has you riding a minecart, while you wait out and dodge their projectile attacks, only to play an admittedly satisfying rendition of the classic Whack-A-Mole arcade game. While we're on the theme though, the boss fights are where this game has the others beat, as they're not only far longer, oftentimes having numerous phases, but also far more complex with their attack patterns and abilities. This isn't to say all of them are crazy difficult. You still have your simple ones where you just dodge their charges while jumping on their backs, and then you have others that put you in a trance with their beautiful dancing skills and a banger theme. Oh, that was just me as well. Jokes aside, Donkey Kong Country Returns features some of the best yet hardest boss fights the franchise had seen yet. Some of the best examples are, funnily enough, all bird type enemies. At the end of the ruins, you come across a nest with a large egg in it. As you approach it, the Tiki tribes smash the gong behind it, causing both you and the egg to drop into an arena, where you have to face off against Stu. Stu will hover around the room, dropping bombs that act as your main means of damaging him. Some of these bombs explode to leave a trail of fire that makes its way across the ground from one side to the other. All the while this is happening, Stu can dive down across the top end of the screen, meaning you have to pay attention to both the ground as well as Stu in the air. This is even more pronounced in his second phase, where he drops a ton of bombs across the ground at once, each with varying detonation times, while also soaring across the screen at the same time. The idea is to pick up the bombs and hit him while he is diving down, as it makes for an easier throw, but the decision making and especially reaction time needed to decide all of this is quite rough when you're just starting out. The other chicken bird boss that I would argue may even have the final boss trumped is the fight against Colonel Pluck. Pluck pilots the Stompy Bot 3000, and if that name wasn't obvious enough, his main method of attacking is stomping you with his massive legs. Timing your movements to get under him and avoid his stomps are hard enough due to his awkward steps, but he will also rapidly speed up at times, making it practically impossible to avoid getting under him without getting hit. You also cannot jump at any point while under him, due to his spikes that protrude down from his cockpit. That being said, after doing a few stomping cycles, he will take to the air, slamming down. After a few more of these, his spikes will flip to reveal some chains, which you can then grab and then ground pound to deal damage. His second phase isn't nearly as bad, thankfully, as he takes to the sky, dropping countless eggs before once again slamming down to reveal his weak spot. He was probably the toughest boss so far by quite a large stretch. Before I could celebrate, however, I was flung into the final world of the main story. the perilous and ever so intimidating volcano stage, and its difficulty certainly matches its fearsome aesthetic. This world has it all: annoying enemies that require the blow feature to damage, auto-scrolls that have you dodging copious amounts of fireballs while trying to avoid a one-hit kill if you're not quick enough. The world also features what I'd argue is the toughest minecart stage in the entire game. Roasting rails has you jumping from minecart to minecart, all while climbing across collapsing ceilings. The problem with this level is that not every jump is the same. Some require just a light tap, while others require a full-on long jump. Problem is, it's hard to tell when you're moving at such high speeds without some trial and error. I died a significant number of times on roasting rails, far more than any stage so far, or at least for a while. The world finishes with one final auto-scroller that has you taking a rocket to the top of the tower. The level itself isn't the toughest, but it does throw a lot at you and requires both slowing down and speeding up to truly avoid all obstacles. Like any other vehicle stage, you're only allowed one hit, so you better make sure you're locked in. After ascending the tower and entering the statue's mouth, we're greeted with one final cutscene, showing Tiki Tong transform his fellow demons into two giant hands. If by some miracle you didn't know this was a Nintendo game, I'm sure you'd know by now. Tiki Tong doesn't screw around. From the very get-go you'll find out that his attacks are fast. So fast in fact that the developers had to include an indicator that gave players a signal for when he was about to attack. From there, it's all a reaction speed test. If you're fast enough, you'll be able to dodge most of his attacks. Problem is, some of them, like his smash, he can hold off on and wait you out, so you need to be concentrating the whole time. If you do die to this boss, which I'm sure everybody did, it restarts you straight from the cutscene, meaning there's no way to collect Diddy Kong again. You must then beat the whole boss with the 2 lives given to you on Donkey Kong. This adds to the challenge as the few hearts that do drop during the fight are either on top of his lightning fast attacks or drop while on fire, meaning you have to wait before you can even collect them. His second phase is even worse in my opinion. He has numerous attacks, most of which involve dropping flaming enemies on top of you or flying them towards you. These are often drawn out and are very hard to fully dodge. The timing on jumping onto his head as well gets harder and harder, with the final slam giving you mere milliseconds to get on top of him. All the while he sends out shockwaves across the ground and bumps you off if you don't perfectly jump on top of his head. Precise jumping, crazy reaction times, and unforgiving lives makes Tiki Tong one of the hardest bosses not just in this game, but in the entire franchise. I did eventually beat him, and man did it feel good. The game ends with a final cutscene showing Donkey Kong punching the goddamn moon into these suckers, only for it to bounce straight back up into place while a rain of bananas comes down on all the restored animals of the world. With the bananas collected and the animals' sanity returned, let's see the damage done. At the end of Donkey Kong Country Returns, I died a total of 62 times, making it slightly harder than Donkey Kong Country 3, but far easier than Donkey Kong Country 2. Despite the long wait and its new but fresh theming, Donkey Kong Country Returns would garner significant praise upon its release, with many feeling it was a worthy addition to the franchise. Its commercial success led to the development and release of one final game, one that is often now considered the pinnacle of the franchise. That game was Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Now with Retro Studios once again in the driver's seat, the only question to remain was how much harder did they make it? Tropical Freeze starts off once again with a view of Donkey Kong Island. This time however it's being viewed from afar, from an oncoming threat, a particularly icy one at that. The Kremlin army once again takes a back seat, replaced this time by the Snowmads, a group of Arctic animals based on the stereotypical Vikings. After blowing away the Kongs, the Snowmads take refuge on Donkey Kong Island as they cover the whole island in an eternal ice age. On the other side of the sea, Donkey Kong crash lands into a plane which ironically had crash landed itself into a tree, with the now frosty Donkey Kong Island situated perfectly in our vision, almost as if it's taunting us. We begin our treacherous journey to take back our beloved homeland. Mangrove Cove acts as the very first level of Tropical Freeze, and as such has a lot of the same design choices from previous starting levels. The level plants a Dozy who walks side to side at an extremely slow pace before moving to Punchy Patties who are now stationary but can jump. Harmless enemies aside, the level also introduces the new underwater mechanics, a feature that wasn't present in Returns. The first thing you'll notice is there is no longer any need to continuously press a button to swim upwards. Instead, all movements in the water are controlled simply by the control stick. Not only does this give far more control over your underwater movements, but it also frees up more buttons which now have other abilities attached to them, like the corkscrew attack, which gives players a fighting chance against the creatures lurking in the depths. To make things slightly harder however, an underwater gauge was added to simulate the need for oxygen, meaning players are forced to either swim to the surface to get air or collect air bubbles to avoid drowning. There are a few other additions, but we'll discuss them as we get to them. The Lost Mangroves, which acts as the first world of this game, doesn't have too many challenges within it. Shipwreck Shore introduces us to our second ally, allowing us to swap out Diddy Kong with Dixie Kong. Dixie retains her propeller hair ability, giving a second burst of height after a jump. Unlike in Donkey Kong Country 2, however, this ability can only be used for a short burst, and not as a means of gliding continuously. The last ally to feature in this game is none other than Cranky Kong himself. You can use his cane to not only defeat hard to stomp enemies, but also as a pogo stick to allow for higher jumps. The differences between your allies' abilities allows for a rather unique take on problem solving, one that hasn't been available in previous Donkey Kong Country games due to the limiting factor of there only being one other playable character available. This is further expanded upon as your allies also gain unique abilities that can only be used underwater. Now this may sound like a lot to take in at once, and the sheer number of potential options may prove challenging to some at the start, but as we'll see over the course of the game, it'll become very apparent just how useful and borderline broken some are over the others. As I alluded to during the return segment, the shop returns once again in Tropical Freeze, this time with a far bigger selection of goodies. These can range from extra hearts to invincibility and even balloons that will automatically save you from falling off ledges. Again, I didn't buy anything outside of lives should I need them, as I didn't want any extra advantages while going through this playthrough. I should also briefly mention here that I am playing the Switch edition, and as such got to choose between funky mode and normal mode, which if you hadn't noticed yet is the mode I decided to go with. From my limited knowledge on the mode itself, I believe funky mode is what many consider to be easy mode, as Funky Kong features a completely separate moveset to Donkey Kong, with many of them being designed in a way to help newer players get accustomed to the tougher platforming gameplay associated with the franchise. Speaking of difficulty though, a running trend in these games is the immense difficulty spikes that come from each minecart stage. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I believe Tropical Freeze to have some of the easiest ones. I forgot to mention this when talking about returns, but the switch from the nostalgic 4:3 aspect ratio to the more modern 16:19 aspect ratio means the field of view for each level is greatly expanded. This plays a crucial role in auto-scrollers like the minecart levels, as it gives players significantly more time to see what is happening ahead of them. That then begs the question, if Returns had this, then why did the minecart levels in Returns give me so much trouble? The answer to that lies in the number of hits allowed. See, Tropical Freeze for whatever reason reverted back to the 2-hit cap on minecarts. You could argue this was changed in order to allow for tighter platforming or more precise jumps in these specific levels, but from what I could tell, I never felt that the minecart levels were particularly harder as a result of this. In fact, I think Returns had more instances of quick decision making, especially with ducking and jumping distance. I will say that High Tide Ride, in particular, suffers from a particularly odd design choice. There is a section in this level that requires you to jump from one railing to another by pushing left and right on the control stick. This not only tests one's reaction speed, but also their ability to view what's ahead and act accordingly. This would be an honest challenge if the camera didn't place itself in such a way that instinctively made you press the control stick in the wrong direction. I'm not sure if I was the only one to fall for this, but the track being underneath me at the end here made me want to press down on the control stick to jump over to it, which obviously didn't work and resulted in a few deaths. They even have a segment towards the end of the level that perfectly aligns the camera for this type of gimmick. Now that's more so just a small nitpick on my part, but small negatives aside though, where Retro shined was once again with their boss fights. From the designs to the fight mechanics of each one, these are some of my favorite boss fights in the entire series. Even from the very first boss fight against Pompey, you can see just how much thought and care went into each of them. From their expansive movesets to their seemingly endless number of phases, each boss feels entirely unique in both their theming and abilities. Now while this makes them a far harder challenge due to the unpredictability of their attacks and just the sheer number of things that are happening on the screen at once, it makes them extremely fun to face as you work out their specific weaknesses in each phase while dodging the rest of their blows. Defeating Pompey moves us onto the second world, known as Autumn Heights, which introduces an important mechanic into the designs of multiple levels going forward. I've mentioned it before, but one of Donkey Kong Country's defining features is its fast, action-paced platform of gameplay. This was certainly the case for the original trilogy, and the games flourished as a result. With the release of Returns, however, the pacing of the gameplay was notably slower. This was most likely due to a number of reasons, from Donkey Kong being slower to control in general to design choices within certain levels, oftentimes causing the player to have to wait. Heck, even the upgrade to a 16:9 aspect ratio most likely had an effect, as you'd have more time to see what was ahead of you and plan accordingly. With Tropical Freeze taking the majority of its inspirations from Returns, something had to be done to speed up the gameplay, at least in certain segments. That's when you load into Windmill Hills and come across platforms that start to crumble underneath you. These not only shift one's focus to the next platform immediately, but they also implemented in sections that often have other enemies flying towards you or on the same platforms. Having a timer baked into the platforms themselves is a classic design choice when it comes to shifting the pace of a level. Now for those of you that have played these games, you're most likely stroking your chin and thinking, but hold on, didn't Returns have these types of platforms as well? And you'd be correct. Returns featured similar platforms to these in numerous levels, but what I want to make obvious is the difference in the frequency of its use. Returns use this design sparsely, whereas Tropical Freeze made it a core feature in plenty of levels. Just in Autumn Heights alone, we have this section in Windmill Hills, we then have to rush our way across more crumbling platforms in Mountain Mania, before quickly jumping across countless more while also avoiding flying enemies in Wing Ding. You may chalk this up as a part of the world's theme, but this design choice remains prominent in every world to come. Frantic Fields in Bright Savannah has you dashing across moving platforms, some of which crumble away or get hit by lightning. This idea of increasing pace is further reimagined in Cannon Canyon, this time having tree trunks that fall towards the player as they shoot their way through the level in barrel canyons. Even the stages in Seabreeze Cove, which are mainly underwater, receive a similar effect with its rapid streams. Irate 8 does a fantastic job of building pressure throughout the level until you ultimately have to race your way to the surface while avoiding all the bombs and the rapidly closing walls. Sea Stack Attack switches out the crumbling platforms for sandy ones that slowly descend after you've stood on them. These platforms often also have slamming spike traps above them, further adding to the challenge. Certain levels like Cliffside Slides are wholly designed around this mechanic, and its rapid pacing makes for one of the more difficult levels, as not only are the jumps needed very precise, but they also must be done in quick succession of one another. Now I hope I don't come off as saying that the game must be fast in order to be difficult, or that slower paced games are extremely easy. Rather, I believe that games that can expertly weave in faster paced areas or sections while remaining somewhat slower are more often than not the hardest as a result of that, and I think Tropical Freeze does this extremely well. Now, after painstakingly working our way through each world, we finally get a chance at taking back our beloved Donkey Kong Island. The levels placed here are some of the hardest in the entire franchise. I've already mentioned Cliffside Slide and its challenges, but you also have Aqueduct Assault, which heavily features collapsing pillars. Blurry Flurry is a rocket barrel stage that has some of the tightest flying in the entire franchise, where the tiniest movement could result in a hit, and most likely a death considering how few hearts there are during the level. And then we have the holy trinity of challenge: Forest Folly, Frozen Frenzy, and Meltdown Mayhem. I died more times in these three levels combined than I had in the rest of the playthrough. Forest Folly combines swinging vines with extremely precise windows to jump, with platforms that shift their motion requiring ground pounds to bounce off of to each other. With countless flying enemies in the way, this one proves to be far harder than I initially thought. The unforgiving nature of these levels continues in Frozen Frenzy, which reintroduces the Electroids, who just happen to take my vote for the most annoying enemy in the game. They first appeared in Returns, mainly as obstacles, but are far worse here as they can now shoot out currents of electricity that cover platforms should they trip the wire underneath them. The worst part is, many of these wires aren't even activated unless you as the player trigger them. This could be because you tilted a platform too high from standing on top of it, or pulled one too far down while climbing some vines. They're extremely hard to see at first, and they honestly feel kind of cheap with some of their placements. Meltdown Mayhem might have one of the most ironic names in the entire franchise, because I was certainly having one while playing through it. The first 3/4 of the level don't pose much of a threat. It's when you start riding across the level on Ramby, before being forced to outrun a wave of lava, that it gets to be extremely challenging. You essentially have to keep your momentum up at all times, otherwise you're going to be drowning in lava. Tag on excruciatingly precise jumps that need to be made within a split second, and you've got one of the most intense endings to a level in the entire game. After dashing our way through the end of this level, however, we finally gear up to take on the leader of this whole fiasco. Our final challenge presents itself in the form of Lord Frederick, the king of all snowmats. The fight itself starts off relatively simple, with you dodging the ice balls he fires over at you. Some of these will release tucks that you can then use as ammunition as you chuck them back over at Lord Frederick. He'll make things a tad bit harder by dancing around, but there are moments where he will stand still for a moment. Hitting him will have him jump over onto the main platform and charge you. This gives you an opportunity to jump over him and hit his back. Each phase has you damaging Frederick in this way, and it's this very design that I have a problem with. Lord Frederick is very much designed to be a dodge and wait boss, where your only chances at damaging him happen when he charges you. Each phase has him cycling through other abilities, like calling down ice dragons on the platforms or raising them up before dropping them into the lava. Following each of these, he will once again shoot out enemies for you to use. This becomes rather tedious over multiple attempts. With each phase, his charging speed gets faster and faster, to the point where in his final phase, he's essentially the Flash. It doesn't help that the hitbox on his back is very slim. If you jump too early, he pierces you. Too late, and he dashes right under you. And each phase requires you to jump on his back 3 times before phasing him. Guess how many times he does his dash in each rotation though? Yep, you guessed it, 3 times. This means that were you to miss a jump, you'd have to let him cycle all the way through all of his other attacks before getting another chance. This makes this fight extremely long, even more so if you have to reset and go through phases 1 and 2 again. I can't tell you the number of times I died from making stupid mistakes out of just sheer boredom and frustration. He's definitely a challenging test, don't get me wrong, but I wouldn't necessarily say he's the hardest final boss in the franchise. Defeating him results in us once again Falcon punching him, Team Rocket style out onto his own crew. With his horn in hand, we ring out our battle cry signifying our victory as the ice on the island melts away. As the crew performs a banger, we're greeted to the credits, bringing an end to this whole thing. At the end of Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, I had died a total of 98 times, placing it as the second hardest Donkey Kong Country game in the entire franchise. As it stands, we have the original Donkey Kong Country as the easiest, followed by Donkey Kong Country 3 and Returns, who essentially put up the same challenge. Tropical Freeze takes the next spot, making Donkey Kong Country 2, at least according to this test, the hardest Donkey Kong Country game in the entire franchise. Now, as with any video like this, the results are purely subjective in nature. While I do think I provided a good deal of analysis as to why certain games may prove to be more challenging than others, there's nowhere to say that this will be similar or even remotely close to any other person's experiences with these games. At the end of the day, the Donkey Kong Country franchise remains one of the best in the platforming genre, and I wholeheartedly believe that its difficulty plays a large role in why many believe that to be the case. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, do consider dropping a like or subscribing. I hope you all have a good day, and I'll see you all in the next one.